how can you explain sensus divinitatis? Which I believe is a term coined by John Calvin to describe the sense of the divine that sort of seems to exist within people. Muslims have the concept of fitra, this sort of this pulling towards God that even if you don't personally feel it, maybe you've talked yourself out of it or something. It does seem anthropologically that wherever we look, people tend to have some kind of sense of the sacred and the profane and the numinous and the religious. If that does not actually latch on to something real, why do we have it?
So again, I feel like there's, again, the theist has a very good answer to this question, which is that we have it because it's accurate.
That's
true.
But remember, this is not a series of questions that theists have a more ready and obvious answer to than atheists. It's a question that atheists cannot answer. And I think it's rather presumptuous to say that, or to imply that atheists simply cannot explain why we may have developed a sense that does not latch onto something real.
Oh yeah, I mean, there are all sorts, as in you could come up with all sorts of explanations. You could talk about how it might have some sort of evolutionary advantage. One of my friends, who's a biologist, sent me an article the other day that was talking about the use of religion in sort of like social cohesion, and also the idea that I can't remember the exact wording of this, but he'll kill me because I'll just butcher this. But talking about how the sense of a religious theistic God would be is very useful for things like having a sense of fulfillment and love in your life. Kind of, it's like a kind of stand-in person that is always there and can be supportive and sort of present and can fulfill that psychological need. And I sort of think that this is a point where, of course, the theist would say this is exactly what the theist would predict. It's just also not what the atheist would not predict. The sensus divinitatis, if I'm saying that correctly. It is sure, it's not implied by atheism in the same way that it's implied by theism, but atheism would not be an expected observation of a world without God that we wouldn't have a belief about God. In the same way that it wouldn't be an expected observation of a world without chairs that we would never have a belief about chairs.
But it does seem, well, this is more or less a version of the argument from desire that C.S. Lewis advanced famously.
Is this in Mere Christianity?
I think so, yes. Yeah, I'm almost certain it's from Mere Christianity, where Lewis points out that we have this desire. I mean, he's not speaking on like an anthropological sense, analyzing humans. He just sort of says, any person who really pays attention to their own desires will find within themselves and find very strongly a desire for something that's not of this world. And if I find myself with a desire for something that cannot be satisfied by this world, the only or best explanation is that I was not made for this world, that it's satisfied by something else. And an expanded version of this is to say, look, from an evolutionary perspective, people want to say, oh yeah, but it's just a sense that we've evolved. Like, why did we evolve hunger? To help us get food. Why did we evolve tiredness? So that we could sleep. Why thirst? It'd be strange indeed if we had all developed this perpetual hunger, even though there was no such thing as food.
I think that
if there was nothing that could actually satisfy it, in other words.
Well, I think that the atheist response to that would be, well, there is something that satisfies our desire for a belief in God, and it's a belief in God. And nobody disputes the idea that theists exist, right? I mean, that would truly be I know some theists have argued that atheists don't exist, but I've never heard an atheist argue that theists don't exist. That would be radical. Somebody should do a paper on that. I feel like that we don't have enough philosophy papers that are published just to kind of say something batshit and then leave.
Well, I've often thought about the fact that, how Jordan Peterson says, you're not really an atheist, man. He once actually said, oh, you think you're secular? Are you in a museum? Are you looking at art? Well, what makes you think you're secular then? He sort of has this vision. And again, I've did a whole video trying to understand his religious philosophy where something like that begins to make sense. But I've often thought people do the same thing in the other direction. People don't act religiously. And the example I always give is when they mourn people's death.
Yes, yeah. Does that make sense if somebody's... I mean, I remember really annoying... I went to Sunday school as a kid. I remember really annoying the very, very friendly young man running it, when I was like 6 or 7, because they were talking about like sin and the idea of, well, when you're Christian, you're free of sin, and then like you get to go to heaven if you're free of sin. And I remember being like, mate, why did you let me live past my christening? You could have. Hell sounds like it is enough worth avoiding.
Yeah.
You should have killed me after you christened.
Yeah, it could have done you a favor. I mean, yeah, it is strange the way people treat death and react to death if they truly believe in an afterlife. In Twelfth Night, Olivia's mourning her brother's death, and the fool comes up to her and says, I'm going to prove that you're a fool. And she says, go on then. And he says, like, why are you crying? Why are you upset? And it's because my brother's dead. And she says that he's in heaven, and he says, I think he's probably gone to hell. And she goes, no, he's in heaven. And he goes, well, more fool you for mourning someone who's in heaven. And it jumped out at me because it was a sort of Shakespearean way of putting the point that I'd been making for a while, which is that, like, what are you mourning for? Okay, like, Alex, you're being totally naive, and you're not considering that people are just upset that they're going to be separated from the person they love. But that's not right either, because if I found out that I was never going to be able to speak to you again, Joe, I'd be pretty upset about that. Like, if you were going on like an expedition to Mars or something, and for some reason there was no communication, and I literally would never see you again, I'd be pretty upset about that.
But
if I found out, especially if you were the one on the ship, like, if I found out after you take off, and I'm never going to speak to you again anyway, that the ship just like exploded and you're now dead, I think I'd be upset in a different way. It would like change the sadness that I feel, right? And so intuitively to me, it can't just be the separation. There has to be something stronger about the death itself. And, when I made a reel about this, people in the comments were sort of saying, tell me you don't understand emotions without telling me you don't understand emotions, or so, this kind of stuff, just sort of as if like I'm being like really stupid. Oh, he just doesn't get it. But it's like, the point is I do get it. I do get, like, of course you're going to be emotional, of course you're going to be upset, but why would you feel that way if you truly believed in the way that you think you believe, that this person's gone to heaven?
Yes, yeah, exactly. I mean, I once met at a pub a Christian antinatalist, which is a fascinating, like, to say. I think he had to kind of, and I'm sure that this is just like heresy, but he was a reformed Christian, as in, like, following reformed theology and believed in predestination. He said, well, if I think that God has only chosen a few people, I don't want to have kids, because chances are they're going to go to hell, and I would love my kids. And I remember thinking, oh, wow, that's because it just is, a worldview that's so unfamiliar to me. And I remember, actually, that kind of is in the logical extension of both loving your children and the idea of
I mean, Christians are certainly encouraged.
Well, no, but then it conflicts with go forth and multiply.
Yeah, but then I don't know if that's like a commandment. I mean, like, Paul was celibate, at least ostensibly. He, says he was, and like seemed to think that celibacy was a good thing. He says at one point that, it's best to be as I am, but if you really can't keep your hands off each other, then at least go and get married, like, Jesus himself is probably celibate, probably doesn't have a wife, depending on which sort of esoteric Gnostics and people that you speak to. And so, like, it doesn't seem like, it can't be, in other words, a Christian necessity that you must have children, because otherwise, Paul would be this grave sinner, Jesus would be this grave sinner, and so maybe there could be some track to that.
Yeah,
I don't know. I've never considered it before.
No,
I do think there's something a little bit sort of too game theoretical about it that sort of misses what's important.
What is it? Well, I suppose I think
about
that's the charge
kids
that
and
antinatalists generally get, isn't it? That's
maybe,
but I'm sure that they'd say that's not an argument. That's just you saying I want kids.
Yeah, it's interesting that, I suppose you might be doing them a favor by sort of saving them the trial altogether. I suppose the Christian would say that communion with God is such an infinite good that it's worth running the risk. But then I don't even know if that is true.
Well,
that it would be worth it even then. That's an interesting point. But okay.
Yeah, what was the question?
We were talking about
divinitatis.
we were talking about sensus divinitatis, and how you were saying about there being people who let me actually think.
Oh yes, the atheist the atheist answer to the atheist answer to C.S. Lewis's challenge of like, well, why would we evolve hunger if we don't have food, is to say, well, we don't hunger after God, we hunger after a belief in God. If the belief is doing for an atheist, the belief is doing the explanatory work rather than God doing the explanatory work.
But then why would we have a desire for a belief in something which doesn't exist?
I mean, it does seem like there are examples where we potentially have this. I mean, I'm going to butcher some like psychological literature here. So I'm probably getting this wrong. I'm going to preface that. But I remember reading a couple of papers about self-judgments and the idea that humans, on average, overestimate themselves in a whole host of ways. And they asked people questions about themselves and then tested those attributes. And basically they found that people would overestimate themselves in a whole host of ways. I can't remember the exact properties, but I think like one of them was like how attractive they are and all sorts. And like, and when they tested them, they found that they were overestimating themselves. But the only people that didn't were people who were like depressed. And that they had a fairly accurate view of themselves. This was explained to me by a professor when I was in third year. And I remember thinking, God,
I wonder which way around that was for them. Is it like because they were depressed, they were more accurate, or because they had a more accurate view of themselves, they just get depressed?
But one thing that this does demonstrate, potentially, if this finding still holds, it could be really out of date now. Is that it is possible that there would be beliefs that are suited for surviving and thriving that nonetheless are not true.
This is actually the exact example that Richard Dawkins gave to me in response to the same challenge. Was
really?
Precisely that consideration about people who think they're more attractive than they are. But like attractiveness is still a thing. It's still a metric which you can place yourself on legitimately or illegitimately, right? But if God just doesn't exist, then the desire for him, it's not like you desire him like to be slightly bigger than he actually is, or you know what I mean? Like it's just like this thing that doesn't exist at all, and yet you develop this desire for it. I mean, Richard Dawkins also then said, well, you can desire all sorts of things. I mean, like a person might desire to, mate with a attractive, famous supermodel, but it's never going to happen. And I was like, yeah, but the supermodel exists, right? And it does seem like it's actually quite difficult to come up with an analogy for something that we would claim, that we wouldn't dispute people almost universally desire in some sense, and yet maybe doesn't exist.
Yes, I suppose it depends, because if you cast it in terms of propositions, the proposition that you are more attractive than you are is just as false as the idea that God exists. So like that, but if you're cashing out in terms of objects, I can see why that might. I mean, one thing I suppose you could say in response to that, I'm not entirely convinced by this response I'm about to give, but would be the idea that, well, if God is the maximal point of things like intelligence and goodness and X, Y, and Z, then a desire after that would just be an extreme desire after loads of things we already desire in an everyday sense, and that might be potential. I mean, that's kind of an ill-formulated response, but
that's also something that Dawkins and I sort of discussed, this idea that there are things that we desire in the world that we've just sort of turned up to 11 or sort of abstracted or formed into this one great big archetype. I must say it does seem mysterious to me. It would be as if I'm saying like, I think that like food is an illusion. I don't think it exists. And you're like, well, hold on, like, I feel like I can see it, and I'm like, yeah, that's just because it's an evolutionary adaptation that you like get this illusory sense that food exists. And you'd be like, well, why would that? Like, what possible reason would there be for that? And I'm like, well, by believing, there's obviously good reasons that we can have. Like, if we believe that there's food there, then we can like come together to eat it together, and so we develop this universal sense of hunger. That, yeah, like everybody everywhere has this sense of hunger, but it's totally just an evolutionary adaptation, man. And it's because, by evolutionarily inventing this illusion of food, we get to like eat meals together, and we get to spend time together, and we get to go hunting, and we get to do all this kind of stuff, Like, it would just seem really strange that we've all just got this desire for this thing, which we also think is actually fulfilled in many cases, but it's just completely illusory.
Yes, no, I think that's fair. But I suppose with the food thing, you directly experience food, and so you're arguing that direct
God,
experience
right?
is actually no. People
directly experience as God, but you just say that it's an illusion, and I'm saying you experience the food in front of you, but it's just an illusion. Your brain is just tricking all of your sense data into thinking that there's something there.
I suppose there are differences of degree rather than differences of kind here,
it's
in the sense
stupid analogy, but you get what I'm saying.
I do get what you're saying. Is in like with the food thing, because I can verify it with other, but also it's with other people's. Like, as in, I think that if everyone, if people could publicize their religious experiences, in the sense, if one of my very good friends is a very, very committed Catholic, and he often explains when he takes Eucharist, sometimes it's just this feeling overcomes him. And I was like, yeah, if you could make that feeling public in a qualitative sense, you could beam that into everyone else's head, I'm sure I would believe in God.
Also, in fairness, like if people actually died as a result of not believing in God, in the same way that they die from not eating food, that would probably do something.
This also tugs at the question of utility of belief. Like, are there legitimate reasons to believe in? Like, say that belief in God is useful and fulfilling. Is that a legitimate reason to believe in it, even if it's not true?